Hello, video game cultures. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here, especially in a room full of such wonderful, impressive people, especially this person right here. You. I'm pointing at you. My favorite. This is pre-recorded from my lair, as you can tell. So I have no idea who I just pointed at. But all that to say, I really wish I could be there in person. Unfortunately or fortunately, I am co-hosting a conference in Salt Lake City, like literally right now. So I'm joining you remotely from a hotel room when I join you for Q&A, and this video has been pre-recorded. But I want to say that I know it's not the same. I definitely don't want to bring the energy down. I wish I could be there in person so much. So I'm going to try and keep this video super short, super fun. And I, again, am so thankful for the opportunity to tell you all about my most recent research. And I am so jealous that you all get to go for beers later. Anyway, let's get into it. Hello, video game cultures. My name is Dr. Ashley Guajardo, and I am here to talk to you about what players want. So I'm going to start with this question. From all the video games that you have played, can you tell me an NPC, and not tell me literally, right? I can't hear you. This is pre-recorded. But can you tell me, writing it down on a piece of paper, who would you like to date? Out of all the video game characters, any gender, doesn't matter, who is the most appealing romantically to you? Now, this is something that you keep private. I'm not going to be collecting these responses. Write it on a piece of scrap paper, write it in a Google Doc, text it to your mom, whatever. Just write it down now. It's going to be a little bit of interactivity, despite the fact that this is an asynchronous recording. I don't know. This could be a disaster. Okay, and then I want you to note down, or at least think about your answer. Why did you choose that fictional character? What are the qualities that you like about this fictional character? And then I want you to just hold on to what you wrote, right? So I'm going to tell you about the research that I conducted. And then at the end, I'm going to show you what my participants said of who they would most like to date and what they liked about them in nerd media. Okay? All right, great. I'm presenting data today that comes from a study I did over this past summer. So this is super fresh. I've just started analysis, which is why I applied to the conference, because I really wanted to chat about my research ideas with all you very smart people. But alas, fate had other plans. So my end goal of doing this was to think about how people fantasize romance in general through different types of media. I interviewed 20 fantasy nerds and I did a participant observation. In terms of where this research is coming from, my background and training is in sociology. So I'm really interested in how, as a society, we determine what people can and can't do. Pulling from Giddens and Foucault in particular, I'm looking at this kind of disciplinary power that laws, politics, medicine, and education exert over us with regards to sexuality. So games are a part of culture, right? You heard it here first. People make games. So the norms, values, and beliefs that people have presumably get embedded into those games. There are regulatory boards like the ESRB in the United States and PEGI in Europe, which determine the goodness of fit of certain video games to be sold in stores. The second problem, or the second thing that I'm thinking about, is that popular culture in the West, at least, has depicted gamers and nerds as masculine, as socially awkward, as shy, and as sexless. Okay, so this is in spite of research where we know that gamers tend to be of all genders, right? In all ages, and not necessarily these stereotypes. We also know from really recent research from Askin, Shivanan, and also Tompkins and myself, that gamers are creating thirst traps of popular video game characters online. Like, search Asterion on TikTok. I dare you right now. Pull out your phone, make sure it's on silent, like turn the volume off, but just type in Asterion into TikTok and see what you get, right? So we have, on the one hand, this idea that society regulates and controls how we experience and express sexual desire. And then on the other hand, we have games being seen as these sexless uh, pieces of media, which we know is not true. So this is where I am interested in how players experience and express romance. To do that, I attended a fairy ball. Fairy ball. What are fairy balls? I'm going to show you some examples in a second. But fairy balls are this romantic event, a dance event, essentially, where people kind of sort of live action role play out romantic fairy tales. So in summer 2024, I went to one of these fairy balls. I've been to them in the past, but I specifically went to one for the purposes of research. I paid the organizer additional money, $200 extra, to have flyers to recruit participants to then do interviews with me and talk about their experiences at these balls, how if and how they are a romantic experience, how this fits into participants' daily lives, and also the types of media that these participants consume. Spoiler, it's quite nerdy, right? These are nerds. These are our people who are dressing up and putting on elf ears and giant prom dresses to go and dance. I also conducted 21-hour-long interviews with people who had attended a romantasy event in the past 12 months. I just had the rule that you had to be over the age of 18 for inclusion criteria. A large number, as you would expect because of my recruitment, of the folks who participated in the interviews also attended this fairy ball, but I put flyers at local bookstores in Salt Lake, and also had friends help distribute the call for participants in their networks of folks who also attend romantasy balls in other states. What am I talking about when I'm talking about romantasy balls? Well, first of all, I'm going to disappear for a second. The magic of Hollywood. This is so you can see the photos. These are not the event I attended. I wanted to respect participants' privacy, and I also had a deal with the event organizer where I would not be capturing photos from the event for research purposes, because that brings up a whole load of privacy concerns. So these are instead photos, like in the bottom left corner, from a Baltimore, Maryland event called the Spring Fairy Ball. And at the top, I found an example from the UK. This is from the Night Court Ball by Gauntlets and Gowns. And then on the bottom, we have the Fairy Court Ball in Biloxi, Mississippi. Okay, so these photos give you an idea of what the event is like. Essentially, people get dressed up in costumes. Some of them reference characters from books or from films. For example, the Night Court Ball has characters from Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses. Otherwise, pretty similar to a Renaissance fair or something that you might see at Worldcon. These are people who are towing the line between fancy dress, cosplay, and live action role play. These events typically include things like fancy dinners and then dancing. Oftentimes, there are vendors that sell cosplay goods and materials. So who were the participants? These are the participants. You can read this, right? No, it looks great on my screen. I'm teasing. This is the full list of participants for the purposes of transparency. Of course, I've used pseudonyms. These are the folks that I interviewed. But here is a better participant summary. So of the 20 people who participated, I only had one man. This one masculine person I had to reach out to directly and say, no, please, please, please participate, because he was very concerned about taking up space in a woman-dominated area, which, like, for women's leisure pursuit, he was very conscious of the fact that it's a space for women and he didn't want to take up space. So that was kind of interesting. I had 3 non-binary participants and 16 women participants. In terms of race, 3 identified as biracial and 17 identified as white, which is partially reflected in those pictures that I showed you. This is a very white pastime, but this is also a product probably of doing research in Salt Lake City, Utah. The occupational prestige had a mean of 61. So occupational prestige is something that some sociologists care about. It's been falling out of favor because it's a complex and fiddly measurement. we don't have time to get into this tool and all the problems with this tool, but what's interesting is that the mean was 61 for the participants. And what I found was that this is on the higher end of occupational prestige. This is the same rank as like management, folks who are office managers or teachers. So these are people who are respected in the community and have, middling income. In terms of homeowner, I asked this question as well to determine another kind of data point on social status. Only 30% or 6 out of 20 were homeowners. This is America. This is the United States right now. It's very difficult to buy a house. Our interest rates are really high. In Salt Lake City, it's about 7%, which is quite high. When I bought my house, for example, it was 2%. So we can see how difficult it is to buy a house. And then I also asked about relationship status. Part of me was curious if folks are seeking out these romantic events in romantic books and, romancing Asterion in Baldur's Gate 3 because they're lonely. And I mean, you could be in a relationship and lonely, right? But 75% of participants were in relationships. So something I did to try to diversify my data set, because I was getting a lot of straight white women, to be perfectly transparent and frank, is that I went to the Legendarium. So this is from a newspaper article in the Salt Lake Tribune when the Legendarium first opened. So this is a fantasy science fiction themed bookstore that is explicitly queer and highlights genre fiction by and for queer and Black Indigenous. I went to this bookstore. I gave them my participant recruitment flyers and said, hey, would you be willing to share my research with anyone interested? And I did get quite a few folks from this method of recruitment. Remember when I asked who you wanted to date? I'm curious if you measure up to my respondent set. Here we can see this is a word cloud. So the larger the name, the more frequent that name was given by participants. So Rhysand is a character from A Court of Thorns and Roses, which is a book series that was super popular with respondents. Xaden Ryerson is a character from Fourth Wing. Cassian is a character from A Court of Thorns and Roses. Asterion is from Baldur's Gate 3. And in terms of video game characters, I'll just point out some of the other ones that we see with Geralt from The Witcher, Sadie Adler from Red Dead Redemption 2. We see Karlach, and then we see Dungeons and Dragons NPCs, just generally, because we love D&D for flirting with our friends, right? That's why we all play D&D. Ethan Winters from Resident Evil 8. Okay, and then there are other characters here, like Din Djarin from The Mandalorian. The reason why I find this interesting is because the population I studied is not the typical gamer population. And in fact, I did not include must be a video game player as part of the recruitment criteria. I didn't do that because I know so many people self-select out of gamer identities because they think it's masculine. They think you have to have read all of the Dragonlance novels in order to count, right? So we know from past research that women, people of color, queer people often opt out of a gamer identity. So instead, I just said, hey, if you get dressed up and go to these fantasy balls, tell me which fictional character you would most like to date. And in that regard, it's really interesting that Asterion and Karlach and Geralt and D&D NPCs have come up. Ethan Winters, right? Sadie Adler, that these characters have come up as dateable when that was not part of the inclusion criteria. Who are these characters? Well, I went ahead and pulled the most common, according to Google, fan art images. Unfortunately, most of these are generated by artificial intelligence. I do not support the use of artificial intelligence art. I think it steals from artists, but these were the top Google results for these characters. What's important here is that you see that the top 3 are tall, dark, and handsome. When we think about what nerds want, for the most part, it turns out to be quite stereotypical, right? It aligns with what we would assume our cultural values are. This gets back to what Anthony Giddens and Michel Foucault say, that as a society, our desire is regulated and controlled through social systems. So when we think about what nerds want, it's, well, what do people want? What is considered sexy or desirable in our culture? Tall, dark, and handsome is a cliche, but at least for the top three, it proved to be true, at least in terms of aesthetics. And then we have Asterion. So Asterion is, in many ways, the opposite. I think he's tall, but he's very pale, right? He's known as the pale elf for a reason. And I'm going to get booed. I don't think he's that handsome. This is a video game conference. Why am I talking about A Court of Thorns and Roses at a video game conference? Who let me in? Who gave permission for me to? Well, I'm here. It's too late. No, what I wanted to point out is that there is a long history of books and novels being adapted to games and vice versa. So we have the Dragonlance novels, right, which were adapted into a D&D campaign. And then kind of the opposite, R.A. Salvatore was commissioned by Wizards of the Coast to write a series of novels set in Faerun. And then we have the Forgotten Realms book series. And there are a lot of books, right? Like most of you probably have read these books. So there is a long, long history of literature and film and other media bleeding into games, particularly role-playing games. So why not A Court of Thorns and Roses? Why not think about these fairy balls as LARP adjacent at the very least? Oh, maybe it's gender? Okay, I didn't say that. So let's talk about what the participants liked about these characters. Okay, so what's really interesting is that, except for hot, so when, again, this is a word cloud, so the bigger the word, the more frequent participants use that word to describe why they like the character, we see that the top response was protective. So again, we're seeing desire through this lens of what is safe and acceptable. The majority of participants were women. I did not ask about their sexual attraction, but the majority of respondents did cite masculine characters. Could be indicative of heterosexual, bisexual, pansexual desire. And we see protective come up, which is a very safe, hegemonic masculine characteristic. We also see supportive. We see funny. We see good listener. We see sweet, and then we see hot. One of my favorites is actually down here, men with a slutty little waist. I think that's quite good. Some of the other characteristics, though, are maybe less common. We also see smart, strong, dark, romantic, old, tortured, blokey, which I quite liked. Sexually liberated, great in bed, rugged, possessive, responsible. Nice. Just nice. Can't we just have a nice love interest for once? So how do you compare? Take a second to reflect. I really wish I were here now. I would really like to have a discussion on this. Okay, so in conclusion, what I found through the study is that participant romance choices are relatively safe and reflect this gender-based expectation that you're going to pick someone who is conventionally attractive and who has conventional values associated with heteronormativity. I was interested that the reason for the appeal overwhelmingly wasn't physical. Of course, physical characteristics were present, but personality choices, right? This is leading towards something that I'm currently writing about with Christina Ask, Tanya Shivanan, and Jess Tompkins, which is the idea of a fangirl gaze, right? What is hot and sexy for fangirls might not be just tall, dark, and handsome, right? But people are smart and kind and nice and protective, and they care about their friends, right? Still, this reflects safe gender-based expectations. Also interesting is that this maybe shows that larger cultural norms are a stronger influence on desire than subcultural models, right? So if we think about gamers and nerds and people who read fantasy books as this subculture, this research obviously has its limitations, very small sample size, but at least shows that the larger cultural norms and expectations are present within those communities. So thank you so much for having me and for listening and for paying attention. I can't wait to use hotel Wi-Fi to answer your questions if you have them. Here is my contact information if you would like to get in touch and share your thoughts and ideas. It's ashley.guajardo@utah.edu. I would absolutely love to hear from you. But even more, I'm so excited to turn the session over to all the wonderful panelists here. And I'm so sad that I can't be on your panel because you're going to give great papers. Thank you so much.